African resistance against European colonialism.
By Selena.
Slowly.
Ashley.
And Giovanni.
Before the 1880s, Africa was a continent full of powerful kingdoms, trade routes, and rich cultures. It was a place shaped by its own history, not by outsiders. But in the late 19th century, European explorers began arriving, curious at first, but their reports there's something much bigger back home. What began as exploration slowly turned into a race for land, resources, and control. Azevedo reminds us that the colonization was never a simple takeover across the continent. Africans persisted in battles and diplomacy and through their cultures. Here I have a picture of Africa before the 1880s as well as the trade routes that they used. My main topic was exploration and conquest. European involvement in Africa began with exploration, or at least that's how they justified it. They claimed that they were bringing Christianity and civilization, but these early journeys were really the first steps toward imperial control. Explorers like David Livingstone traveled deep into the continent, sending their descriptions of Africa's rivers, landscapes, and resources back home. His writings fascinated Europe and encouraged the idea that Africa was a place to be claimed. Henry Stanley took this even further. His expeditions mapped key regions, especially the Congo, opening the door for European powers to move in. All of this momentum led to the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, where European nations divided Africa among themselves without a single African present. New borders were drawn with no regard for cultures, ethnic groups, or existing colonies. Once the land was claimed on paper, European armies soon followed. Using advanced weapons and deceptive treaties, they pushed deeper into the continent under the belief that they were civilized again. Yet Africa was never an easy conquest. From the very beginning, exploration sparked resistance. Every attempt to control African land and people was met with determinism, strength, and will to defend independence.
The impact of colonialism undoubtedly damaged the psychological and cultural well-being of the African people and their descendants. Yet we see that their culture still prevailed through this time, and in some ways it was strengthened through adversity. As we see in Roots, enslaved Africans were given new names. Kunikinte was forced to change his name to Toby. African people were also taken from their families and abused, treated as property, and they were forbidden to read or write, but they were able to keep their culture alive through oral traditions. Like we see in the language Ukrainian, a funeral song was kept alive for hundreds of years, just through being passed down. And then I have a poem. This was published in 1842, and it says, Mother, when around your child, you clasp your arms in love, and when with grateful joy you raise your eyes to God above. Think of the Negro mother when her children is torn away, sold for a little slave. Oh, then for the poor mother pray. Father, whenever your happy boys you look upon with pride, and pray to see them when you're old, all blooming by your side. Think of that father's withered heart, the father of a slave who asked a pitying God to give his little son a grave. So this poem just kind of shows the way that families were ripped apart and how that would have damaged them psychologically.
I was tasked with the forms of resistance throughout the African diaspora. Across continents, people of African descent have constantly demonstrated a refusal to be participants in slavery or any other form of external control. Numerous resistance movements emerged specifically in response to the brutal oppression experienced in regions like the Caribbean, the Americas, and Southern Africa. These efforts were often motivated by admired leaders who clearly articulated their political agendas and the devastating effects of the injustice on the Black community. The primary forms of oppression were broadly categorized as political, social, and economic resistance. Across the African diaspora, resistance took many forms, each a story of courage against overwhelming odds. In South Africa, families lived under the harsh walls of the apartheid, yet their voices, through marches, music, and leaders like Mandela, rose louder than the systems meant to silence them. Across the ocean in 1803, at the Igbo landing, a group of enslaved Igbo people chose death over bondage, walking into the water in an act of spiritual defiance that still echoes as a symbol of unbreakable dignity. In Trinidad and Tobago, colonizers tried to suppress African drumming, but the people transformed steel and discarded oil barrels into the powerful rhythms of the steel band, turning oppression into art that carried their cultural heartbeat forward. And in Haiti, the enslaved population did the unimaginable, overthrowing the French Empire, becoming the first Black republic, and proving that freedom, once demanded collectively, can reshape the world. Together, these stories reveal a simple truth. Across centuries and continents, African people resisted not just to survive, but to reclaim identity, culture, and power.
So, I'll be talking about the legacies of colonialism and how they shaped the story of Africa long after colonization officially ended. One major legacy is the way that borders were drawn without any African representation. As stated earlier in the exploration and conquest slides, Azevedo explains in the Exploration and Conquest of Africa that the result of the Berlin Conference, at which Africans were not represented, Africa was divided into some 25 or so small colonies, quite often carved into European capitals without regard to cultural links among the people conquered. This is a legacy because these artificial borders forced different ethnic groups and split others apart, which ultimately created both long-term conflict and political instability, which is still seen today in some African nations. Another part of this larger story is the legacy of the exploitation of African land and resources. Several European powers became keenly interested in colonial acquisition in Africa as sources of raw material and cheap labor, as Azevedo states. This legacy continues today because the economic structures created during colonial rule left many African countries dependent on exporting raw materials while the wealth flowed to European powers. This sort of extraction-based system set up during colonialism created economic inequality and instability that still affects Africa today. Lastly, the story includes the violence and forced labor used to maintain control. An example of this was seen in the film Commerce and Clash of Civilizations, where in the Congo, people faced brutal punishment where their limbs were amputated and people's hands and legs were chopped off if they didn't meet certain quotas. This legacy deeply harmed communities and left a lasting trauma. Families lived with fear, loss, and instability, and that emotional damage did not end when colonialism ended, but was used to control people and become part of the painful historical memory that still affects Africans and African societies today. Tying all these points and legacies together, Wayana's How to Write About Africa reminds us that colonialism also left a cultural legacy. It shows us how Africa is still described by using old colonial stereotypes like treating Africa as if it were one country. These simplified images and stereotypes partly come from the very same systems that drew borders, took resources, and used violence against the African people. This this just shows that the impact of European colonialism did not end with independence. Its ideas, practices, and portrayals continue to shape how the continent is viewed today. And this is our concept statement and our bibliography.